Okay, so an introduction to the history of psychology, Chapter 10, Evolution and Individual Differences. As we saw in Chapter 9, experimental psychology was a product of Germany. Across the Atlantic, the pioneering U.S. spirit was poised to accept a viewpoint that was new and practical. Evolution provided such a view, and the United States embraced it as no other country did. Not even in England, the birthplace of modern evolutionary theory, did it meet with the enthusiasm it received in the United States. The translation of evolutionary theory into psychology created a program that was uniquely American, and it caused the center of psychological research to shift from Europe to the United States, where it has been ever since. Evolutionary theory before Darwin. The idea that both the earth and living organisms change in some systematic way over time goes back as far as the ancient Greeks. Such observations, along with the growing tendency towards objectivity, allowed some early Greeks to hold rudimentary theories of evolution, and by the 18th century, several prominent individuals were postulating a more detailed theory of evolution, including Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, who believed that one species could be gradually transformed into another. What was missing from these early theories was the mechanism by which the transformation took place. To first postulate such a mechanism was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. In his Philosophie zoologique, 1809, the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck noted that fossils of various species showed that earlier forms were different from current forms, therefore the species changed over time. Lamarck concluded that environmental changes were responsible for structural changes in plants and animals. If, for example, because the scarcity of prey, members of the species had to run faster to catch what few prey were available, the muscles evolved in running and would become more fully developed as a result of frequent exercise they received. If the muscles evolved in running were fully developed in an adult of the species, Lamarck believed that offspring of this adult would be born with highly developed muscles, which also enhanced their chances of survival. This theory was called inheritance of acquired characteristics. Obviously, those adult members of a species who did not adjust adequately to their environment would not survive and therefore would not produce offspring. In this way, according to Lamarck, the characteristics of a species would change as the traits necessary for survival changed, transmuting the species. Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, was born in the industrial town of Derby, England, and was tutored by his father, who was a schoolmaster, and later by his uncle. He never received a formal education. At age 17, Spencer went to work for the railroad for the next 10 years, held jobs ranging from surveyor to engineer, and in 1848 he gained employment in London as a journalist. First as a junior editor of The Economist, and then a freelance writer. Spencer's interest in psychology and in evolutionary theory came entirely from the reading during this time. One especially influential book was John Stuart Mill's System of Logic in 1843. Spencer's education, quotes, was also enhanced by a small group of intellectuals he befriended. This group included Thomas Huxley, shortly to become the public defender of Darwin's theory of evolution, George Henry Lewes, a fellow journalist whose broad interests included acting, writing, biographies, and science, and Mary Ann Evans, a fellow journalist better known as George Eliot. Clearly, Spencer was not inhibited by the lack of formal education. From his voracious reading and the exchanges with his groups of friends during the 1850s, Spencer acquired a general vision of the world that was to have a more pervasive effect on the 19th century thinking than any other philosopher of his era. Spencer's view of evolution. An early follower of Lamarck and later Darwin, Spencer took the notion of evolution and applied it not only to animals but also to the human mind and human societies. In fact, he applied the notion of evolution to everything. Everything, according to Spencer, began as an undifferentiated whole. Through evolution, differentiation occurs so that our systems become increasingly complex. This notion applies to the human nervous system, which was simple and homogeneous eons ago, but through evolution has also become highly differentiated and complex. The fact that we now have complex nervous systems allows us to make a greater number of associations. The greater number of associations our organism can make, the more intelligent it is. Our highly complex nervous system allows us to make an accurate neurophysiological, and thus mental, recording of events in our environment, and this ability is conducive to survival. J.P. Gulliford, in 1967, a student of Titchener's, I don't know if I've been saying that all along, Titchener's Titcheners. So we will encounter later on in this chapter. Note that it was Spencer that then that introduces the term intelligence as it is used in modern psychology. In his explanation of how associations are formed, Spencer relied heavily on the principle of contiguity. Environmental events that occur both simultaneously or in close succession are recorded in the brain and give rise to ideas of those events. Through the process of contiguity, our ideas come from a map of environmental events. However, for Spencer, the principle of contiguity alone was not adequate to explain why some of the behaviors persist, whereas others do not. To explain the differential persistence of various behaviors, Spencer accepted Bain's explanation of voluntary behavior. Spencer said, on the reoccurrence of the circumstances, these muscular movements that were followed by success are likely to be repeated. What was at first an accidental combination of motions will now be a combination having considerable probability. Spencer placed Bain's observation within the context of evolutionary theory by asserting that a person persists in behaviors that are conducive to survival, that those that cause pleasant feelings and abstain from those that are not, those that cause painful feelings. Spencer's synthesis of the principle of contiguity in evolutionary theory has been called evolutionary associationism. The contention that the frequency of probability of some behavior increases it. Excuse me. Sorry about that. That was hardcore. Anyways. Okay, so the contention that the frequency or probability of some behavior increases as it is followed by a pleasurable event and decreases if it is followed by a painful event has become known as the Spencer-Bain principle. This principle was to become the cornerstone for Thorndike's connectionism, as we're going to see in Chapter 11, and Skinner's operant behavior. The next step that Spencer tied his theory directly to Lamarck's. Spencer claimed that an offspring inherited accumulative associations that its ancestors had learned. These associations that preceding generations had found to be conducive to survival were passed on to the next generation. That is, there is an inheritance of acquired associations. Spencer's theory was a blending of empiricism, associationism, and nativism, because he believed that the associations gained from experience are passed on to offspring. For Spencer, then, instincts are nothing more than habits that have been conducive to survival for preceding generations. Instincts that have been formed in past generations, just as habits are formed in an organism's lifetime through association. When Darwin's work appeared, Spencer merely shifted his emphasis from acquired characteristics to natural selection. The concept of survival of the fittest, a term that Spencer introduced in 1852, that was later adopted by Darwin, applied in either case. Social Darwinism. There was a basic difference between Spencer and Darwin in how they viewed evolution. To Spencer, evolution meant progress. That is, evolution has a purpose. It is the mechanism by which perfecting is approximated. Darwin believed no such thing. For Darwin, evolution did not manifest any pre-structured, pre-established, or predetermined design or order throughout natural history. There is no overall direction in evolution, i.e. no ultimate purpose or a final end goal or organic evolution in general, or human evolution in particular. On the other hand, for Spencer, the attainment of human perfection was just a matter of time. Spencer went further, saying that evolutionary principles apply to societies as well as individuals. Spencer's application of this notion of survival of the fittest to society came to be called social Darwinism. As Spencer saw it, humans in society, like all other animals in natural environments, struggle for survival, and only the most fit survive. According to Spencer, if the principles of evolution are allowed to operate freely, all living organisms will approximate perfection, including humans. The best policy for government to follow, then, is the laissez-faire policy that provides a free competition among its citizens. Government programs designed to help the weak and poor would only interfere with evolutionary principles and inhibit a society on its course towards increased perfection. The following statements demonstrates how far Spencer believed governments should follow the laissez-faire policy. Probably slaying that. Sorry about that. Something like that. If individuals are sufficiently complete, both physically and mentally, to live, they do live, and it is well they should live. And if they are not sufficiently complete to live, they die, and it is the best that they should die. harsh. Interestingly, Spencer opposed only governmental programs to help the weak and poor. He supported private charity because he believed it strengthened the character of the donors. Clearly, Spencer's ideas were compatible with U.S. capitalism and individualism. In the United States, Spencer's ideas were taught in most universities, and his book sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Indeed, when Spencer visited the United States in 1882, he was treated like a hero. As might be expected, social Darwinism was especially appreciated in the U.S. industrialists by U.S. industrialists. In a Sunday school address, John D. Rockefeller said, "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest. The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which bring cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. This is not an evil tendency in business. It is merely a working out of the law of nature and the law of God." Andrew Carnegie went even further, saying that for him, evolutionary theory, or social Darwinism, replaced traditional religion. "I remember that light came as in a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of the theology and supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. All is well, since all grows better became my motto, my true source of comfort. Man was not created with an instinct for his own degradation, but from the lower he had risen to the higher forms. Nor is there any conceivable end to his march to perfection. His face is turned to the light. He stands in the sun and looks upward." It should not be concluded that Darwin was entirely unsympathetic towards applying evolutionary principles to societies in the way that Spencer had. In The Descent of Man in 1874, Darwin said, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We, civilized man, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the progress of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile and the maimed and the sick, and we institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands, who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man, excepting in the case of man himself. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animal to breed." If Spencer, however, who featured such thinking and emphasized the belief that societies, like individuals, would approximate perfection if natural forces were allowed to operate freely. Although we have focused on Spencer as an evolutionary and social theorist, that is no means the limit of his contributions to the history of psychology. He was a popularizer of positive science in the tradition of Comte and the utilitarian ethics in the tradition of Bentham. In addition to the legacy of the Spencer-Bain principle, his 1855 textbook, Principles of Psychology, was the most widely read English language work on psychology for decades. William James used it in his first psychology course he taught at Harvard, and honored the work in his own book of the same title. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, was born in Shrewsbury, England, in the same year that Lamarck published his book describing the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Incidentally, it was one of those interesting quirks of history that Darwin and Abraham Lincoln were born just hours of each other. As previously noted, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a famous physician who dabbled in, among other things, evolutionary theory. Darwin's father, Robert, who was also a prominent physician, and his mother, Susanna Wedgwood, who came from a family famous family for their manufacturing of chinaware. Robert and Susanna had 6 children, with whom Charles was the 5th. His mother died in 1817, and he was when he was 8 years old, and his care thereafter was primarily the responsibility of his 2 older sisters. Receiving his education at home, Charles was eventually sent to school, where he did so poorly that his father predicted that someday he would disgrace himself and his family. Outside of school, however, he spent most of his time collecting and classifying plants, shells, and minerals. Academically, matters did not improve when, at 16 years of age, Darwin entered medical school at the University of Edinburgh. He found the lectures boring and could not stand watching operations performed without the benefit of anesthesia. Following his father's advice, Darwin transferred to Cambridge University to train to become an Anglican clergyman. At Cambridge, he drank, sang, and ate. He was a member of the Gourmet Club. His way to an 1831 graduation with a mediocre academic record. Darwin remembered collecting beetles as the activity that brought him the most pleasure while at Cambridge. If Darwin's passion for entomology, the study of insects, that put him into contact with the professors of botany and geology at Cambridge, with whom he studied and did field research. For example, immediately upon graduation from Cambridge, Darwin went to a geological expedition to Wales headed by Adam Sedgwick, a Cambridge professor of geology. Although Darwin was certainly interested in the expedition, he also saw it as a way of temporarily taking his religious vows. A more permanent escape on the high seas was soon to be available to him. While at Cambridge, Darwin had befriended the botanist John Henslow, and it was Henslow who first offered the position of naturalist aboard the Beagle. Because his family commitments, Henslow had to decline the offer and suggested that Darwin go in his place. At first, Darwin's father refused his permission because he would need to pay Charles's expenses on the trip and because he felt the journey would interfere with his son's clerical career. After discussing the matter with other members of the family, however, Darwin's father changed his mind and endorsed the adventure. The journey of the Beagle. Thus it was at the instigation of one of his instructors that Darwin signed on as an unpaid naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, which the British government was sending on a multi-year scientific expedition, because Captain Robert Fitzroy believed in physiognomy, recall from Chapter 8. He almost rejected Darwin as Beagle's naturalist. On becoming very intimate with Fitzroy, I heard that I had run a very narrow risk of being rejected on the account of the shape of my nose. He was convinced that he could judge a man's character by the outline of his features, and doubted whether anyone with my nose could possess sufficient energy and determination for the voyage. But I think he afterwards well satisfied that my nose had spoken falsely. Fitzroy, 1805 to 1865, was himself an interesting figure. He became a firm believer in the biblical account of creation, but also a scientist associated with the key advances in the field of meteorology. Additionally, he was noted as a political figure during England's golden age of exploration, serving for a while as governor of New Zealand. The journey of the Beagle began on December 27th in 1831. From Plymouth, England, Darwin was 23 years old at the time. The Beagle first went to South America, where Darwin studied marine organisms, fossils, and tribes of Indians. Then in the fall of 1835, the Beagle stopped at the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin studied huge tortoises, lizards, sea lions, and 13 species of finch. Of special interest was his observations that tortoises, insects, plants, and other organisms differed somewhat from island to island. Even when the islands were separated by a relatively short distance, the Beagle went on to Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, and in October of 1836, Darwin arrived back at England, where he went to work classifying his enormous specimen collection. So back in England, even after Darwin returned to England, his observations remained disjointed. He needed a principle to tie them together. Reading Thomas Malthus's an essay on the principle of population in 1798 furnished Darwin with that principle. An economist, Malthus, in 1776 to 1834, observed that the world's food supply increased arithmetically, whereas the human population tended to increase geometrically. He concluded that food supply and population size were kept in balance by such events as war, starvation, and disease. Darwin's embellished Malthus's concept and applied it to animals and plants as well as to humans. And in January 1839, Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, with whom he eventually had 10 children. It was about the time that he married Emma that Darwin began to have serious health problems that were to plague him for the next 30 years. At one time or another, he experienced severe gastric pain, heart palpitations, acute anxiety, depression, and a variety of skin disorders. Most scholars agreed that Darwin's ailments were psychosomatic. Interesting. During the course of his life, Darwin consulted most of the leading physicians and surgeons of his day, but none of them ever found anything organically wrong. In part because of his health problems, and in part because he realized that what he was working on was revolutionary. Perhaps the two were related. Darwin delayed publication of his theory of evolution for more than 20 years. In fact, there's no reason to believe that Darwin's theory would have ever been published, only after his death, if it had not been for forceful demonstration that the time was right for such a theory. And in June 1859, Darwin received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, 1823 to 1913, describing the theory of evolution almost identical to his own. Wallace, too, had been influenced by Malthus's essay, Malthus, I don't know how to say that guy's name, Malthus's essay, as well as his own observations in the Amazon. And in the Malay Archipelago, Charles Lyell, the eminent evolutionary geologist, reviewed both Wallace's and Darwin's idea and suggested that both Wallace's paper and one hastily prepared by Darwin be read at the Linnean Society on the same day, and with both authors absent. This was done, and neither paper roused much interest. Darwin's epoch-making book on the origin of the species by means of natural selection in 1859 was published 2 months later. By then, there was so much interest in evolutionary theory that all 1,500 copies of the book sold on the first day it was available. Following the publication of Origin, were several public debates over the validity of Darwin's theory, but Darwin didn't participate. Instead, it was his friend Thomas Henry Huxley who effectively defended the theory. For this, he was dubbed Darwin's bulldog. The colorful Huxley was the patriarch of what would now become one of England's most famous academic families. His grandsons were Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, and Nobel Prize winner Sir Andrew Huxley, who received an award for his contributions to understanding how electrical action potentials work in the nervous system. One public debate pitted Huxley against Bishop of Oxford Samuel Wilberforce. At one point, their meeting was interrupted by former Captain Fitzroy, who thumped his Bible and spoke out against Darwin. A few years later, Fitzroy committed suicide, perhaps because he felt that he was at least partially responsible for Darwin's theory of evolution. Because of the abundance of data Darwin amassed and the thoroughness of his work, we attribute the theory to him and not to Wallace. But what follows may someday be referred to as the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution as a testimony to the similarity in their ideas. Darwin died on April 19, 1882, at the age of 73, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey near the grave of Isaac Newton. Incidentally, Wallace was one of the most outspoken opponents of social Darwinism. Rather than accepting the laissez-faire philosophy concerning human competition, Wallace believed that humans could and should guide their own evolution. For Wallace, this meant creating government programs to help those individuals less equipped to compete in the complex society. Far from being a historical footnote, Wallace was a leading naturalist of the day, and the person Darwin most cited. His work can also be connected to Mill, to phrenology, and to the considerations of individual differences that we will consider later on in this chapter. Darwin's theory of evolution. The reproductive capacity of all living organisms allows for many more offspring than can survive in any given environment. Therefore, there is a struggle for survival. Among the offspring of any species, there are vast individual differences, some of which are more conducive to the survival than others. This results in the survival of the fittest, a term Darwin borrowed from Spencer. Now, for example, if there was a shortage of food in the environment for giraffes, only those giraffes with necks long enough to reach the few remaining leaves on tall trees would survive and reproduce. In this way, as long as food remains scarce, giraffes with shorter necks will tend to become extinct. Thus, natural selection occurs among the offspring of the species. Natural selection of adaptive characteristics from individual differences occurring among offspring accounts for a slow transmutation of the species over eons. Evolution then results from a natural selection of those incidental variations among members of the species that prove to have survival value. Darwin defined fitness as an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Fitness, then, is determined by an organism's features and its environment. Features that allow adequate adjustment in an organism's environment are called adaptive. An organism possessing adaptive features are fit, and those who do not are not. Notice that nothing is said about strength, aggression, and competitiveness. None of these features are necessarily conducive for fitness. Adaptive features are those features that are conducive for survival in any given environment, whatever those features may be. Also notice that Darwin said nothing about the progress of perfection. Unlike Spencer, Darwin believed that evolution just happens. There is no direction or purpose involved. The direction that evolution takes is completely determined by the features possessed by the members of the various species of organisms and the environment in which those organisms exist. As environments change, what features are adaptive also change, and it goes on forever. Another point worth noting is that Darwin knew nothing about genetics. He understood that traits from parents were passed down to offspring, but not the how. Although the discovery had been made by a monk, Gregor Mendel, in 1822 to 1884, based on his work with breeding almost 30,000 pea plants. He found his findings were not connected to the evolution until around 1900, ironically. Darwin also bred plants and likely had similar data. Evolution and Earth's age. One of the earliest conflicts that Darwin had with the church was the overall age of the Earth. As Darwin saw it, the process of evolution occurred over millions of years. Within the church, at the same time, it was generally believed that the Earth was not nearly as old as was required by Darwin's theory. Therefore, the theory must be false. For their arguments against Darwin, church officials drew upon estimates of the Earth's age based on biblical study. For example, Archbishop James Ushner, in 1581 to 1656, Vice Chancellor of Trinity College in Dublin, after carefully studying various biblical events, concluded that the creation had occurred in 4004 BC. John Lightfoot, 1602 to 1675, Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, was even more specific. After exhaustive study of the scriptures, he concluded that the creation occurred at precisely 9 a.m. on Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC. Even in Darwin's time, there was considerable geological and fossil evidence indicating that the Earth was not significantly older than was suggested by the church authorities. Currently, many scientists estimated that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. And this, of course, is more than what is required by Darwin's theory. However, the debate between evolutionary theory and creationism continues. Human evolution. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin said very little about humans, but later in The Descent of Man, in 1871, he made the case that humans are also the product of evolution. Both humans and great apes, he said, descended from a common distant primate ancestor. Of Darwin's books, the one most directly related to psychology is The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, in 1872. It's like the year after Descent of Man, in which he argued that human emotions are remnants of animal emotions, and that had once been necessary for survival. In the distant past, those organisms capable of such things as biting and clawing survived and reproduced. Somewhat later, perhaps baring the teeth and snarling were enough to discourage an aggressor and therefore facilitated survival. Although no longer as a functional in modern society, the emotions were originally associated with attacks or defense are still part of our biological makeup. It can be seen in human reactions under extreme conditions. Darwin also noted that the expression of human emotions is culturally universal. By observing the facial characteristics of persons anywhere on Earth, one could determine if that a person is experiencing joy, grief, anger, sadness, or some other emotion. For an excellent summary of Darwin's theory of emotions and a discussion of its current relevance, see Elkman in 98. Even if Darwin had decided to let Wallace take full credit for the theory of evolution, he would surely still have a place in our history given the contributions to animal study and human behavior. Darwin's direct comparison of humans with other animals and the expression of the emotions, along with his forceful assertion that humans differ from other animals only in degree, launched modern comparative and animal psychology. It became clear that much could be learned about humans by studying non-human animals. Darwin also influenced subsequent psychology when he was carefully observed the development of his first son, William, born in 1839. He noted when various reflexes and motor abilities first appeared, as well as various learning abilities. Although he delayed publication of his first observation until William was 37, Darwin's report in 1877 was among the first examples of what would be later called developmental psychology. Darwin's influence. To say the least, Darwin's theory was revolutionary. Its impact has not been compared to that of the theorists of Copernicus and Newton. He changed the traditional view of human nature, and it changed the history of philosophy and psychology. Many of the topics dismissed by Titchener, this guy's name, because they did not represent pure experimental psychology, were encouraged in Darwin's theory. Popular topics in contemporary psychology clearly reveal a strong Darwinian influence: developmental psychology, animal psychology, comparative psychology, psychobiology, learning, tests and measurements, emotions, behavioral genetics, abnormal psychology, and a variety of other topics under the heading of applied psychology. In general, Darwin stimulated an interest in the study of individual differences and showed that studying behavior is at least as important as studying the mind. As we see, Darwin's theory of evolution played a significant role in the development of schools of functionalism, and behaviorism. Darwin's influence, however, was not entirely positive. He entertained a number of beliefs now considered highly questionable or mistaken, such as the following. Contemporary primitive people are the link between primates and modern humans, that is, Europeans, and therefore inferior. Women are intellectually inferior to men. Allen, in 1985, says Darwin, at his worst, is Darwin on women. For examples of Darwin's beliefs concerning the intellectual inferiority of women, see Darwin, whatever pages. Long practicing habits become heritable instincts as other words in explaining cultural differences among humans. Darwin accepted Lamarckian theory. In addition to his general impact on psychology, evolutionary theory is currently having a more direct impact. And in 1975, Edward Wilson published Social Biology, a New Synthesis, which attempts to explain the social behavior of organisms, including that of humans, in terms of evolutionary theory, by modifying Darwin's definition of fitness from the survival and reproductive success of the individual, Darwin's definition, to the perpetuation of one's genes. Sociobiology can account for a wide array of human social behaviors. That is, according to sociobiologists, fitness is determined by how successful one is in perpetuating one's genes, but not necessarily how successful one is in producing offspring. By emphasizing the importance of perpetuating one's genes, the sociobiologists place great emphasis on kin or genetic relationships, because one's kin carries one's genes, helping them survive and reproduce, becomes an effective way of perpetuating one's genes. Armed with this conception of inclusive fitness, sociobiologists attempt to explain such things as love, altruism, warfare, religion, morality, mating systems, mate selection strategies, child-rearing strategies, xenophobia, aggressive behavior, neopotism, not sure what that is, and indoctrinability. What Wilson called sociobiology is now called evolutionary psychology. It is extremely popular in the contemporary psychology. We will say more about evolutionary psychology in Chapter 18. As we will see in the remainder of this chapter, Darwin's ideas ultimately gave birth to a uniquely American type of psychology, a psychology that emphasized individual differences and their measurement and their adaptive value of thoughts and behavior, and the study of animal behavior. So before discussing this psychology, however, we must first review the works of Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton. Erasmus Darwin, the physician, philosopher, poet, and early evolutionary theorist, was the grandfather of both Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911. Darwin's cousin Galton was born near Birmingham, England, the youngest of 7 children, the father of a wealthy banker, and his mother was a half-sister of Charles Darwin's father. Receiving his early education at home, Galton could read and write before the age of 3. By age 5, he would grasp any book written in English, and by 7, he was reading Shakespeare for pleasure. Things changed when Galton was sent to a boarding school, where his experiences included being flogged, scarlet fever, hell-raising, enduring sermons from the teachers, and fighting with his fellow students. At age 16, he was sent to Birmingham General Hospital for the study of medicine. He later transferred to King's College in London, then moved to Cambridge University, where he obtained his degree in 1843. Galton's planned to return to King's College to complete a medical degree. But when his father died, he decided not to, so his formal education ended. This era was a high point for the British Empire, with exploration and trade being conducted all across the globe. Consider the famed adventurer, Sir Richard Francis Burton, in 1821 to 1890. After service in India, he clandestinely visited Mecca in 1853, then famously started to search for the source of the Nile in Central Africa soon thereafter. Such explorations were often included as proto-psychological descriptions of new peoples and customs. For example, Burton wrote extensively about the sexual practices different from those in England. Because Galton was independently wealthy, he could work on what he wanted and when he wanted. Revealing in the spirit of the times, after graduation he traveled in Egypt, the Sudan, and the Middle East, and then he came home and socialized with his rich friends for a few years, riding, shooting, ballooning, and experimenting with electricity. After consulting with phrenologists who recommend an active lifestyle, Galton decided to join the Royal Geographical Society on a trip to Southwest Africa. The trip lasted 2 years, and for Galton's creation of a map and previously unexplored territories in Africa, now called Namibia. The Royal Geographical Society honored him in 1853 with its highest medal. Galton was 32 at the time. We can see in Galton's map-making ability a passion that he had all his adult life, a passion to measure things. And in 1853, Galton published his first book, Narrative of an Explorer in the Tropical South Africa. He became a recognized expert on travel in the wild, and the British government commissioned him to teach camping procedures to soldiers. And in 1855, he published his second book, The Art of Travel, which included information on how to deal with wild animals and savages. For his inventiveness, Galton was elected president of the Royal Geographical Society. To further illustrate Galton's passion for measurement, here are a few of his other endeavors. In his effort to measure and predict the weather, he invented the weather map and was the first to use the terms highs, lows, and fronts. He was the first to suggest that fingerprints could be used for personal identification, a procedure later adopted by Scotland Yard. Initially intended as another tool for criminologists, Galton studied composite portraiture, or the creation of new faces based on combining multiple photographs. He discovered that more images used, the more attractive the composite face. He tried to determine which country had the most beautiful women. He measured the degree of boredom at scientific lectures, and he attempted to determine the effectiveness of prayer, and he found it ineffective. One can imagine Galton's delight when he became aware of his cousin's evolutionary theory, with its emphasis on individual differences. Galton believed that there are important individual differences among people, clearly that they should be measured and catalogued. This became Galton's mission in life. The measurement of intelligence. Galton assumed that intelligence is a matter of sensory acuity, because humans can know the world only through the senses. Thus, the more acute the senses, the more intelligent a person is presumed to be. Furthermore, because sensory acuity is mainly a function of natural endowment, intelligence is inherited. And if intelligence is inherited, as Galton assumed, one would expect to see extremes in intelligence run in families, assuming the high reputation or eminence is an accurate indicator of high intellectual ability. Galton set out to measure the frequency of eminence among the offspring of illustrious parents, who compared to the frequency of eminence among the offspring of the general population. For comparison with the general population, Galton studied the offspring of judges, statesmen, commanders, literary men, scientists, poets, musicians, painters, and wrestlers. The results published in The Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into the laws and consequences, were clear. The offspring of illustrious individuals were far more likely to be illustrious than were the offsprings of non-illustrious individuals. Galton also observed, however, that the zeal and vigor must be coupled with the inherited capacity for eminence before eminence can be attained. Eugenics. Galton's conclusion raised a fascinating possibility: selective breeding. If intelligence is inherited, could not the general intelligence of the people be improved by encountering the mating of bright people and discouraging the mating of people who were less bright? Galton's answer was yes, and he called this improvement to living organisms through selective breeding eugenics and advocated its practice. I purpose to show in this book that man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance, under exactly the same limitations as the form and physical features of the whole organic world. Consequently, as it is easy, notwithstanding those limitations, to obtain by careful selection a permanent breed of dogs or horses gifted with particular powers of running, or of doing anything else, so it would be quite practicable to produce a highly gifted race of men and judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. I shall show that social agencies of an ordinary character whose influences are little suspected are at this moment working towards the degradation of human nature, and that others are working towards its improvement. I conclude that each generation has an enormous power over the natural gifts of those that follow, and maintain that it is the duty we owe to humanity to investigate the range of that power, and to exercise it in a way that, without being unwise towards ourselves, shall be more advantageous to future inhabitants of the earth. And in 1865, Galton proposed that couples be scientifically paired, and that governments possessing desirable characteristics to marry. The government was also to take care of educational expenses of any offspring. After reading Hereditary Genius, Darwin wrote to his cousin, "You have made a convert of an opponent in one sense, for I have always maintained that excepting fools, men who did not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work." Darwin gave credit to Galton for calling his attention to the fact that allowing weak members of society to breed weakens human stock. Thus we have noted Darwin was not entirely adverse to what was called social Darwinism, nor, as we have seen, was he entirely opposed to the idea of eugenics. The very mention of eugenics is often considered distasteful given the notion of Nazi atrocities and various modern-day ethnic cleansings. Nevertheless, as Galton observed, animals had long been selectively bred, and almost every culture engaged in some sort of eugenics. Infanticide was practiced by the ancient Greeks and still exists in many countries today. Historically, marriages were usually arranged in most cultures, and implicitly, many social conventions facilitate the same practice worldwide even now. For example, the cheerleader who dates the quarterback. As we will see later in this chapter, eugenics was openly embraced by many American psychologists. Nature-nurture controversy. Galton's extreme nativism did not go unchallenged. Alphonse de Candolle? We're going to say Kendall, in 1806 to 1893, for example, wrote a book stressing the importance of environment in producing scientists. Kendall suggested that climate, religious tolerance, democratic government, and a thriving economy were at least as important as inherited capacity in producing scientists. Such criticism prompted Galton's next book, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. To gather information for this book, Galton sent a questionnaire to 200 of his fellow scientists at the Royal Society. This was the first use of a questionnaire in psychology. The participants were asked many factual questions ranging from their political and religious backgrounds to their hat sizes. In addition, they were asked to explain why they had become interested in science in general, as well as their particular branches of science. Finally, the scientists were asked whether they taught their interest in science, or finally, the scientists were asked whether they thought their interest in science was innate. Although the questionnaire was very long, most of the scientists finished and returned it, and most believed their interest in science was inherited. Galton noticed, however, that the disproportionate number of scientists were Scottish, and that these scientists praised the broad and liberal Scottish education system. Conversely, the English scientists had a very unkind things to say about the English educational system. On the basis of these findings, Galton urged that English schools be reformed to make them more like Scottish schools, where Galton was acknowledging the importance of the environment. He revised his position that the potential for high intelligence was inherited, but that it must be nurtured by the proper environment. Galton, in 1974, clearly stated the nature-nurture controversy, which is still a focus of much of attention in modern psychology. The phrase nature and nurture is a convenient jingle of words, for it separates the two distinct heads of innumerable elements of which personality is composed. Nature is all that a man brings with himself into the world. Nurture is every influence that affects him from his birth. The distinction is clear. The one produces the infant, such as it actually is, including latent faculties of growth and mind. The other affords the environment amid which the growth takes place, by which natural tendencies may be strengthened or thwarted, or wholly new ones implanted. In his next book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development in 1883, Galton further supported his basic nativistic position by studying twins. He found monozygotic or one-egged twins to be very similar to each other, even when they were reared apart. He found dizygotic or two-egged twins to be dissimilar, even when they were reared together. Following Galton's lead, it became very popular to study twins to determine the relative influence of nature and nurture on various attributes, such as intelligence. Twin research remains powerful and popular today. Words and images. In Inquiries, Galton devised psychology's first word association test. He wrote 75 words on a separate piece of paper. Then he glanced at each word and noted his response to it on the other piece of paper. He went through 75 words on 4 different occasions, randomizing the words each time. 3 things struck Galton about this study. First, responses to stimulus words tended to be consistent. He very often gave the same response to all words 4 times he experienced it. Second, his responses were often drawn from his childhood experience. And third, he felt such a procedure revealed aspects of the mind never revealed before. Perhaps the strongest of impressions left by these experiments regards the multifariousness of the work done by the mind in a state of half-consciousness, the valid reason they afford for believing in the existence of still deeper strata of mental operations, sunk wholly below the level of consciousness, which may account for such mental phenomena as cannot be otherwise explained. Both Wundt and Jung used Galton's word association methods. Whether Galton directly influenced Freud is not known, but Galton's work with word associations anticipated 2 aspects of psychoanalysis: the use of free association and the recognition of unconscious motivation. And as Krovitz in 1970 notes, both of his work with words and images also laid the foundation for many subsequent studies on memory and cognition. Mental imagery. Galton was also among first, if not the first, to study imagery. In Inquiries, he reported the results of asking people to imagine the scene as they had sat down to breakfast. He found that the ability to imagine was essentially normally distributed. with some individuals most totally acceptable of imagery, and others having the ability to imagine the breakfast scene in great detail. Galton was amazed to find that many of his scientist friends had virtually no ability to form images. The sensations in their remarks or images were the stuff of all thinking, as the empiricists had assumed. Why was it that many scientists seemed unable to form and use images? Galton also found, not so surprisingly, that whatever a person's imagery ability, he or she was assumed that everyone else had the same ability. That is actually really interesting. Very interesting. Tell me more. Just kidding, it stops there. Anthropometry. Yep, anthropometry. Galton's desire to measure individual differences among humans inspired him to create what he called an anthropometric laboratory at London's International Health Exhibition in 1884. Here, in just about 1 year, Galton measured 9,337 humans in just about every way he could imagine. For example, he measured their head size, arm span, standing height, sitting height, length of middle finger, weight, strength of hand squeeze as measured by a diameter, breathing capacity, visual acuity, auditory acuity, reaction time to visual and auditory stimuli, the highest detectable audible tone, and speech of blow, the time it takes for a person to punch a pad. Some of these measures were included because Galton believed sensory acuity to be related to intelligence. And for that reason, Galton's anthropometric laboratory can be viewed as an effort to measure intelligence, or even the beginning of the mental testing movement in psychology. And in 1888, Galton set up a similar laboratory in the science galleries of South Kensington Museum, and it operated for several years. A handout prescribed the purpose of the laboratory to potential participants. It's like 4 things here. So number 1, for the use of those who desire to be accurately measured in many ways, either to obtain timely warning of remedial faults in development or to learn their powers. 2, for keeping a methodological register of the principal measurements of each person, of which many at any future time obtain a copy under reasonable restrictions. His initials and date of birth will be entered in the register, but not his name. The names are indexed in a separate book. This is number 3, for supplying information on methods, practice, and uses of human measurement. And 4, anthropometric experiment and research, and for obtaining data for statistical discussions. A small fee, 3 pence. For a small fee, 3 pence, a person would be measured in all the ways described above. And for a smaller fee, 2 pence, a person would be measured again at another time. Each participant was given a copy of his or her results, and Galton kept a copy for his files. Among many things that Galton was interested in examining were test-retest relationships, gender differences on various measurements, and intercorrelations among various measurements, relationships of various measurements in socioeconomic status, and family resemblances among various measurements. Because Galton's incredible amount of data existed long before there were computers and even calculators, much of it went unanalyzed at the time. And since then, however, other researchers have analyzed portions of the previously unanalyzed material. For example, Johnson et al. 1985 reported the results of Galton's own analyses, the results of analysis of Galton's data done by researchers after him, and their own considerations for Galton's data. The concept of correlation. The last of Galton's contributions to psychology we will consider is his notion of correlation, which has become one of psychology's most widely used statistical methods. And in 1888, Galton published an article titled Correlations and Their Measurement, chiefly from the anthropometric data, and in 1889 he published a book titled Natural Inheritance. Both works describe the concept of correlation and regression. Galton in 1888 defined correlation or correlation as follows. 2 variable organs are said to be correlated when the variation on one is accompanied on the average by more or less variation on the other, and in the same direction. Thus the length of the arm is said to be correlated with that of the leg. Because a person with a long arm is usually has a long leg, and conversely. In a definition of correlation, the word tend is very important. Even in the above quotation, Galton said that those with long arms usually have long legs. After planting peas of various sizes and measuring the size of their offspring, Galton observed that the very large peas tended to have offspring not quite as large. And that very small peas tended to have offspring not quite small as themselves. He called this phenomenon the regression towards the mean. something he also found when he correlated heights of children with heights of their parents. In fact, Galton found that regression whenever he correlated inherited characteristics. Either Galton had observed the eminent individuals only tended to have eminent offspring. By visually displaying the correlational data in the form of scatter plots, Galton found that he could visually determine the strength of a relationship. But it was Carl Pearson in 1857 who devised the formula that produced the mathematical expression of the strength in the relationship. Pearson's formula produces the now familiar coefficient of correlation, or R. Pearson was Galton's first biographer, an advocate of eugenics and the father of statistics. As Galton's heir, he was the first to hold the Galton Chair of Eugenics at the University of London. Much of his statistical work concerning evolution in one way or another, as did that of the man who replaced him when he retired, Sir Ronald Fisher, and in 1892-1962. The F you solve for when doing analysis of variance is for its inventor, Fisher. Perhaps surprisingly then, the content of your statistics class is another legacy of Darwin. In addition to introducing the concept of correlation, Galton also introduced the median as a measurement of central tendency, and the mean, and he found that the mean to be overly influenced by extreme scores in a distribution, and preferred to use the middlemost, or the median, as in a distribution instead. Galton's contributions to psychology. Few individuals in psychology have more firsts attributed to them than does Galton. Galton's first included study of nature-nurture question. The use of the questionnaires, the use of word association tests, twin studies, the study of imagery, intelligence testing, and the development of correlational technique. Everywhere in his work, we see a concern with individual differences and their measurements, a concern that was a direct reflection of the influence of Darwin's theory of evolution. The approach of Wundt and Tschichincher can be described as nomothetic, whatever. That is, it's looking for the generalized or common elements of the mind. In contrast, Galton's work is ideographic, or looking for the individual differences in human nature. James McKean Cattell, in 1862-1944, studied with Wundt and Galton, reflecting both approaches when he returned to the United States. But of the two, he had been much more influenced by Galton. James McKean Cattell, the Galtonian in America. Cattell was born in Easton, Pennsylvania. He was the son of a Presbyterian clergyman who was also professor of Latin and Greek at Lafayette College, and later its president. Cattell entered Lafayette College before his 16th birthday and stood first in his class without much effort. Among his favorite subjects were mathematics and physics. After graduation from Lafayette in 1880, he traveled to Germany to study with Lotze. Cattell was very impressed by Lotze, and it came as quite a blow when Lotze died a year after Cattell's arrival. The following year, Cattell returned home and wrote a paper on philosophy, and that won him a fellowship at Johns Hopkins University. While at Johns Hopkins, from 1882 to 1883, he did research in G. Stanley Hall's new psychology laboratory. He decided to become a psychologist. And in 1883, Cattell returned to Germany, this time to study with Wundt. Cattell was not only Wundt's first experimental assistant, but he was also the first student from the United States to earn a doctorate under Wundt's supervision. Cattell received a degree in 1886. While with Wundt, Cattell and his fellow student did numerous reaction time studies. Among other things, Cattell noticed that his own reaction times differed systematically from those of his fellow researcher, and proposed to Wundt that individual differences in reaction time that should be explored. The proposal was rejected because Wundt was more interested in the nature of the mind in general, rather than individual differences. After attaining his doctorate, Cattell returned to the United States, where he taught at the Bryn Mawr College and the University of Pennsylvania. About that time, Cattell became aware of Galton's anthropometric laboratory in London and began correspondence with Galton, mainly concerning the measurement of reaction time. Soon Cattell applied for and received a 2-year research fellowship at Cambridge University, where he worked with Galton. In Galton, Cattell finally found someone who shared an intense interest in individual differences. Galton confirmed Cattell's conviction that individual differences were important and that they could be objectively measured. Under Galton's influence, Cattell came to believe that intelligence was related to sensory acuity and was therefore largely inherited. As a self-proclaimed disciple of Francis Galton, Cattell's interest in eugenics is clear. He proposed that incentives be given and the best elements of all people to intermarry and have large families. Cattell and his wife had 7 children, and in fact offered each of his children $1,000 if they would marry a child of a college professor. On his return to the United States in 1888, Cattell was first affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania, where in 1989 he founded the first psychology laboratory for undergraduate students. It was also at the University of Pennsylvania that Cattell administered Galtonian-type measures to his students. And in 1890, Cattell published his techniques and resulted in an article that used the term mental test for the first time. Psychology cannot attain the certainty and exactness of the physical sciences unless it rests on the foundation of experiment and measurement. A step in the direction could be made by applying a series of mental tests and measurements to a large number of individuals. These results would be of considerable scientific value in discovering the consistency of mental processes and their interdependence and their variation under different circumstances. It was also the article that Cattell described 10 mental tests that he believed could be administered to the general public, and a total of 50 tests that he believed could be administered to university students. The 10 mental tests were mainly Galtonian, but Cattell also added a few measurements he learned from Wundt's laboratory. Among 10 tests were hand strength, 2-point threshold, amount of pressure required to cause pain, ability to discriminate between weights, reaction time, accuracy of bisecting a 50-centimeter line, accuracy in judging a 10-second interval, and the ability to remember a series of letters. The more comprehensive series of 50 tests was essentially more of the same. A vast majority of them measured some form of sensory acuity over time. And in 1891, Cattell moved to Columbia University, where he began administering his tests to entering freshmen. Implicit in Cattell's testing program was the assumption that if a number of his tests were measuring the same thing, like intelligence, performance on those tests should be highly correlated. Also, implicit was the assumption that if tests were measuring intelligence, they could correlate highly with academic success in college. That is, for the test of intelligence to be valid, it must make differential predictions about how individuals will perform on tasks requiring intelligence. And in 1901, Clark Whistler, one of Cattell's graduate students, tested Cattell's assumptions. Armed with Pearson's new perfected correlation coefficient, Whistler measured the relationship among Cattell's tests between the performance on various tests and academic performance. Whistler's results were disastrous for Cattell's testing program. He found that intercorrelations among the tests were very low and that correlation between various tests and success in college was nearly zero. Thus, the tests were not measuring the same thing because if they were, they would be highly correlated, and that they were not valid because if they were, scores would correlate highly with academic achievement. With such unambiguous negative findings, the interest in mental testing quickly faded. Whistler switched his field to anthropology and became an outspoken environmentalist. Cattell turned to other aspects of applied psychology, becoming a key figure in school functionalism that we will consider in the next chapter. For the moratorium on mental testing, it was not to last long. Individual differences in intelligence. Alfred Binet. In France, a different approach to measuring intelligence was being tried. One involved directly measuring the complex mental operations thought to be involved. Alfred Binet, I want to call him Binet, but Binet, 1857 to 1911, championed his method of testing. Born in Nice, France, Binet's father was a physician, as were both his grandfathers. Binet's parents separated when he was young, and being an only child, he was reared mainly by his mother, a successful artist. Although he initially followed the family tradition of studying medicine, Binet terminated his medical studies and turned to psychology instead. Being independently wealthy allowed Binet to take the time to educate himself, and he read the works of Darwin, Galton, and the British empiricists, especially John Stuart Mill, among others. Binet began his career in psychology by working with Jean-Martin Charcot in 1825 to 1893, the world-famous psychiatrist at La Salpêtrière. Like Charcot, Binet conducted research on hypnotism, and he claimed that in one study he had been able to manipulate the symptoms and sensations of a hypnotized subject by moving a magnet of various places around the body. He also claimed that application of the magnet could convert fear of an object, such as a snake, into affection. Bennett thought that such findings would have important implications for the practice of medicine in general and for psychiatry in particular, but other research could not reproduce Bennett's findings and concluded that his results were due to poor experimental control. For example, it was found that Bennett's subjects always knew what was expected of them and acted accordingly. When subjects are unaware of researchers' expectations, they did not exhibit the phenomena Bennett had observed, recall Clever Hands. Bennett finally admitted that his results had been due to suggestion and not to the magnet's power, and he resigned from the position at La Salpêtrière in that's a real French word right there, in 1890. The humiliation resulting from his public administration of shoddy methods haunted Bennett all his life. His statement, "Tell me what you are looking for, and I will tell you what you will find," was directed at metaphysicians, but Bennett knew from personal experience that it could apply to researchers as well. Fortunately, Bennett's second career in psychology was more successful. Without a professional position, Bennett directed his attention to the study of intellectual growth of his two daughters, Alice and Madeline, who were 2.5 and 4.5 years old at the time. The tests he created to investigate the children's mental operations were very similar to those of Jean Piaget, later devised. He asked, for example, which of the two piles contained more objects, and found that the answer was not determined by the number of objects in the piles, but by the amount of space the piles took up on the table. Bennett also investigated how well his daughters could remember objects that he first showed them, then by removing them from sight. Bennett also employed a number of tests used by Galton and Cattell to measure visual acuity and reaction time. And in 1890, he published 3 papers describing his research on his daughters. And in 1903, he published The Experimental Study of Intelligence, which summarized the longitudinal study of intellectual growth of his children. And in 1891, Bennett joined the Laboratory for Physiological Psychology at Sorbonne, where he performed research in such areas as memory, the nature of childhood fears, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, creativity, imageless thought, psychophysics, abnormal psychology, craniometry, and graphology. During his years at the Sorbonne, Bennett also investigated individual differences in the perception of ink blots before the famous work of Rorschach. In her outstanding biography of Bennett, Theda Wolff in 1973 said that Bennett was the father of experimental psychology in France and argues that he had more of an enduring impact on U.S. psychology than Wundt did. Individual psychology. Like Galton and Cattell, rather than being interested in what people have in common, Bennett was primarily interested in what made them different. And in 1896, he and his assistant Victor Henry, in 1872 to 1940, wrote an article titled Individual Psychology, which proposed a list of variables on which individuals differ, especially intellectually. What they sought was a way of determining to the extent of which each variable exists in a given individual. With the variables isolated in the way of measuring them available, they hoped that it would be possible to evaluate any individual in a relatively short period of time. Nevertheless, the work of Galton and Cattell was rejected because it placed too much emphasis on sensory processes and not enough on higher mental processes. In other words, Bennett and Henry proposed a cognitive study to study cognitive abilities directly instead of indirectly via sensory acuity. Another reason the work of Galton and Cattell was rejected is that it minimized the importance of differences between the child's mind and an adult's. According to Bennett and Henry, the important variables on which humans differ are complex, high-order processes and vary according to age. The list of such variables proposed in 1869 included memory, imagery, imagination, attention, comprehension, suggestibility, aesthetic judgment, moral judgment, force of will, and judgment of visual space. Unfortunately, Bennett and Henry's goal of accessing a person's higher mental processes took many hours, and interpreting the results then required many more hours of subjective clinical judgment. Even before, devastatingly, however, was the study on their test performed by Stella Sharp, a graduate student at Cornell University. Sharp, in 1899, found very low intercorrelations among the Bennett-Henry tests and concluded, as Whistler had concluded about Cattell's test, that they could not be measuring the same attributes, preferably intelligence. Such findings, along with their own disappointing results, caused Bennett and Henry to abandon their individual psychology project. The experience gained, however, would serve Bennett well in his next project. Assessing intellectual deficiency. In 1899, Theodore Simon, 1873 to 1961, who worked as an intern at a large institution for children with mental retardation, asked Bennett to supervise his doctoral research. Bennett agreed and viewed this as an opportunity to have access to a large subject pool. Also, in 1899, Bennett joined a Free Society for the Psychological Study of Child, an organization that sought scientifically valid information about children, especially in their educational problems. Bennett soon became leader of the society, and in 1903 Bennett and Simon were appointed to the group that the French government commissioned to study the problems of children with retardation in French schools. It was immediately clear that if children with retardation were to receive special education, it was necessary to have an adequate method of distinguishing them from normal children. At the time, variations of Galton's tests were being used to detect mental retardation, and Bennett noted that because of these tests, children who were blind or deaf were erroneously being classified as having mental retardations. And in 1904, Bennett and Simon set out to create tests that would differentiate between intellectually normal and intellectually subnormal children. Their first step was to isolate one group of children clearly diagnosed as normal and another group diagnosed as subnormal. The second step was to test both groups in a number of different ways, hoping to discover measurements that would clearly distinguish members of one group from the other. And in 1905, Binet-Simon scale of intelligence. The 1905 Binet-Simon scale of intelligence. Binet-Simon offered the Binet-Simon scale of intelligence as a valid way of distinguishing between normal children and children with mental deficiencies, a way that was to replace the less reliable physical, social, and educational signs being used at the time to identify children with mental retardation. And in 1905, the 1905 scale consisted of 30 tests, ranging from difficulty to simple eye movements to abstract definitions. 3 tests were measured motor development, and the other 27 were designed to measure cognitive abilities. These tests were arranged in order of difficulty so that the more tests a child passed, the more fully developed his or her intelligence would be assumed. The scale was given to normal children and to children thought to have retardation, all of them between the ages of 2 and 12. Binet-Simon and Simon found that almost all normal children aged 2 and older could easily pass 1 through 6. Also, children with slight or moderate retardation could pass some or all of these tests. Children with severe retardation could only pass a few of them. Most of the tests, 7 through 15, could be passed by normal children between the ages of 2 and 5. Children with slight retardation could pass several of these tests, and children with moderate retardation had great difficulty, and children with severe retardation could rarely pass any of them. Tests 16 through 30 could be routinely passed by normal children between the ages of 5 and 12, but children with even slight retardation had difficulty with them, and the children with moderate and severe retardation could pass none. We see in the Binet-Simon scale a reflection of Binet's belief in intelligence is not just a single ability, but several. With this belief, Bennett reflects faculty psychology. Although he did not accept nativism, that was often accompanies a rationalistic viewpoint. He did believe that inheritance may place an upper limit on one's intellectual ability. But he also believed that everyone functions below their potential. Therefore, he believed strongly that everyone could grow intellectually, and that fact should be the prime importance to educators. And in 1908, Bennett and Simon revised their scale. Their goal was that time was to go beyond simply distinguishing normal children, and children with retardation to distinguishing among levels of intelligence for normal children. The tests were administered to a large number of normal children ages 3 to 13, and if 75% or more of the children of a certain age passed a particular test, the test was assigned to that age level. For example, if it was found that only a minority of 3-year-olds could copy a square, but a majority of 4-year-olds, 75% or more, could copy a square, and essentially all 5-year-olds could do it. In this way, it could be determined whether a given child was performing at, above, or below average. A 5-year-old passing the test that most other 5-year-olds also passed was considered to have normal intelligence. But if that child passed only the test typically passed by 4-year-olds, he or she was thought to have below average intelligence. And if the 5-year-old passed tests normally passed by 6-year-olds, he or she was thought to have above average intelligence. In other words, the child's intelligence level was determined by how much higher or lower than the norm the child performed. And in 1908 revision of the Binet-Simon scale consisted of 58 tests, each showing the age at which 75% or more of the children could perform correctly. And in 1911 revision of the scale included normative data on 15-year-olds and provided exact 5 tests for each age level. The latter allowed a more refined measure of intelligence. For example, if an 8-year-old an 8-year-old child passed all the tests corresponding to his or her age, he or she would be considered normal. It is possible, however, that an 8-year-old will also pass some tests typically passed only by 9-year-olds. The new procedure allowed 1/5 of a year to be added to the child's score for each test the child passed beyond those that were norm for his or her age. Thus, the child's intellectual level could be expressed in terms of intellectual age, that is, the age corresponding with the most difficult tests their child could pass. Binet warned that extreme caution should be taken when interpreting a child's intellectual age. For one thing, he observed that it is quite common for a child to have an intellectual age that was only 1 year behind their chronological age, and that these children probably would have little trouble in school. Children whose intellectual age was 2 or more years behind their chronological age would probably have trouble in standard school program and would need special attention. But even in the latter case, poor test performance did not necessarily mean that the child had mental deficiencies. Before such a label was applied, the test administered had to ensure that the child was healthy and motivated, and when he or she took the test, that he or she was knowledgeable enough about French culture to understand the test. Intelligence quotient. In 1911, German psychologist William Stern, 1871 to 1938, introduced the term mental age. For Stern, a child's mental age was determined by his or her performance on the Binet-Simon test. I want to say it's Binet. I've probably been mispronouncing this the whole time. Anyways, whatever. Stern also suggested that the mental age be divided by chronological age, yielding an intelligence quotient, or IQ. For example, if a particular 7-year-old passed all tests typically passed by 7-year-olds, his or her intelligence quotient would be 7 out of 7, or 1.001, a whole. If another 7-year-old passed those tests typically passed by 5-year-olds, his or her intelligence quotient would be 5 out of 7, or 0.71. And in 1916, Louis Terman suggested that the intelligence quotient be multiplied by 100 to remove the decimal point. It was also Terman who abbreviated intelligence quotient as IQ. Thus, combining the suggestions made by Stern and Terman, we have the familiar formula for IQ. IQ equals mental age over chronicle age times 100. Binet was opposed to the use of intelligence quotient. He was not down. Okay, gotcha. He believed that intelligence is too complex to be represented in simple terms or a number. History shows, however, that Stern's simplifications won out over Binet's opposition. In any case, Binet and Simon had developed their relatively brief, easy-to-administer measure of intelligence, and it became extremely popular by the beginning of World War I. The Binet-Simon test was being used throughout much of the world. Binet's legacy. Binet strongly believed that children of low test scores could benefit considerably if given special attention. Although Binet believed that inheritance may be set in an upper limit on intellectual potential, he also believed that everyone could grow intellectually if properly stimulated. He worried very much about students in classrooms where teachers believe that students' intellectual performance is innately determined. This is, of course, was especially regretful for students who believe to have low intelligence. I've often observed, to my regret, the widespread prejudice exists with regards to educatability of intelligence. The familiar proverb, when one is stupid, it is for a long time, seems to be accepted indiscriminately by teachers with a stunned critical judgment. Those teachers lose interest in students with low intelligence. Their lack of sympathy and respect is illustrated in their unrestrained comments in the presence of the child. This child will never achieve anything. He is poorly endowed. He is not intelligent at all. I have heard such rash statements too often, and they are repeated daily in primary schools. In Binet's 1909 reaction to those who maintained that some children could never accomplish certain things, he indicates that he clearly did not accept this view of intelligence. Never. What a strong word. A few modern philosophers seem to lend their moral support to these deplorable verdicts when they assert that an individual's intelligence is a fixed quantity, a quantity which cannot be increased. We must protest and react against this brutal pessimism. We shall attempt to prove that it is without foundation. Alternatively, Binet believed that mental orthopedics could improve a child's will, attention, and discipline, all abilities that Binet thought were necessary for effective classroom education. Binet in 1909 believed that by engaging in mental orthopedics, children learned how to learn. If we consider that intelligence is not a single function, indivisible, and of a particular essence, but rather that it is formed by the chorus of all little functions of discrimination, observation, retention, etc., the plasticity and extensibility of which have been determined, it will appear undeniable that the same law governs the whole and its parts, and that consequently anyone's intelligence is susceptible to being developed. With practice, training, and above all method, we can manage to increase our attention, our memory, our judgment, and literally to become more intelligent than we were before. Improvement goes on in this way until the time when we have reached our limit. Both Binet and Galton died in 1911. Galton was an old man at 89 who had lived a long, highly productive life. Bennett was 57 and at the height of his career. Oh, okay. Charles Spearman. After a military career in the English army that lasted until he was 34, Charles Spearman in 1863 to 1945 turned to a career in psychology, studying both Wundt and Kolb in Germany. Taking a break in his studies with Wundt, Spearman returned to England to serve in the Boer War. Okay, that lasted from 1899 to 1902. Reading Galton thoroughly impressed Spearman. He performed a number of experiments on village school children, with results tending to confirm Galton's belief concerning the relationship between sensory acuity and intelligence. Spearman found, and not only did measures of sensory acuity correlate highly among themselves, but more importantly, they also correlated highly with cleverness in school. In 1904, he published his results in an article titled General Intelligence, Objectively Determined and Measured. In part because of this article, Spearman was offered a position at the University of London, replacing William McDougall, who, as we will see in Chapter 12, as the director of the psychology laboratory. In order to more thoroughly investigate the nature of intelligence, Spearman laid the groundwork for what became factor analysis. Factor analysis is a complex statistical technique based on correlation. The technique begins by measuring either an individual or a group of individuals in a variety of ways. Next, all the measures are intercorrelated to determine which of them vary together in some systematic way. It is assumed that measures, like tests, that vary together, that is, are correlated, are measuring the same thing. The final step is to examine the matrix of correlations excuse me, to determine which measures vary together and how many factors or influences how many factors or influences needed to be postulated to account for the intercorrelations observed. Spearman found that intelligence could be explained by two postulated factors: individual differences in their competence in such things as mathematics, language, and music. Such abilities called specific factors are called, so mathematics, language, and music, such abilities are called specific factors. Because measures of S tend to be intercorrelated, Spearman postulated an overriding kind of intelligence that he called as a general factor, or the general intelligence, or G. According to Spearman, the G is determined almost exclusively by inheritance. Spearman then had a two-factor theory of intelligence. One factor, S, described specific abilities, and the other, G, described general intelligence. Armed with factor analysis and his two-factor theory of intelligence, Spearman attacked the results of studies such as Whistler's that showed little intercorrelation among Galton and Cattell's measures of sensory acuity, and almost no correlation between measures of sensory acuity and academic performance. Spearman's conclusions about the nature of intelligence are important for three reasons. First one is he emphasized the unitarity nature of intelligence, whereas Binet emphasized its diversity. He viewed intelligence as largely inherited, whereas Binet viewed it as modifiable by experience. It was largely Spearman's conception of intelligence that was embraced by the new testing movement of the United States, not Binet's. That is, IQ was viewed as measuring something like Spearman's G rather than Binet's multifarious intellectual level. Spearman's legacy. Spearman's legacy can be seen in two main ways. His hereditarian notion of one underlying factor of intelligence remains with us even today and represents one pole of the ongoing debate about nature of intelligence. Binet represents the other end of the spectrum, asserting that intelligence was multifaceted and modifiable by experience. As we will see the debate continue in the remainder of this chapter, like Pearson, Spearman was a pioneer in the area of statistics that are used by psychologists. His early version of the factor analysis forms the basis of modern techniques. He also developed a non-parametric alternative to Pearson's correlation. Interestingly, given their mutual debt to Galton, their shared interests, and that both were at the same university, the two men were rivals, not friends. Cyril Burt, 1883 to 1971, was born in London, the son of the Galton family physician. And young Cyril, was exposed to Galton's ideas about eugenics at an early age. He was a student of William McDougall, later Culp, and he worked with both Spearman and Pearson at the University of London. Burt accepted Spearman's concept of G, the general intelligence, and believed education should be stratified according to the student's native intelligence. Students of high native intelligence ability should be provided with more challenging educational opportunities than a student with low native intellectual ability. Furthermore, Burt believed it is fruitless to try to raise a student's intellectual ability through remedial education programs. And in 1932, Burt followed Spearman as the chair of psychology, and in 1946, he was the first person to be knighted for contributions to psychology. Burt retired from the University of London in 1950, but continued to publish papers providing data supporting the idea that G was largely inherited. For example, he studied identical or monozygotic twins, reared together and reared apart. He reported that whether reared together or apart, correlations measures of intelligence for identical twins was 0.70 or higher. And on the other hand, correlations between identical twins and their younger or older siblings were only about 0.40 or 0.50. These data reinforce the ideas that intelligence was largely innate and that a change of environment would not affect it significantly. In the paper published posthumously in 1972, Burt summarized the results of his lifelong research on intelligence, including those just described. The scandal. Leon Kamin, 1974, reviewed Burt's data as presented in 1972 and found a number of discrepancies, suggesting that Burt's data were invented. Burt's data was invented. Scandal. Oliver Gilly, a British journalist, attempted to contact people whom Burt had listed as having gathered data for him and found that they either did not exist or had never gathered data. Gilly in 1977 called for an establishment of a committee to help expose fraud in science. However, finally, in his biography of Burt, Leslie Hernshaw in 1979 charged that Burt had published fraudulent data, supporting his position under a pseudonym and published with a co-author who did not exist. It appeared that the case against Burt was clearly established. However, some argued that the matter was either exaggerated or not proven. Instead of fraud, there had been only sloppy methods of inappropriate attempts to recover data destroyed by Nazi air raids, and others never claimed to have known any fictitious co-author. After reviewing several post-war incidents, including a confounding of his own accomplishments with those of Spearman, Gould posits that Burt was not a rational man. In sum, Green in 1992 concluded that the charge of deliberately falsifying data can neither be established nor disproved with certitude. For more details on Burt's scandal, see also Samuelson, 1992. It is also interesting to note that Burt's conclusions, whether real or fabricated, have been essentially confirmed by other researchers who, like Burt, studied identical twins. For example, Raymond B. Cattell in 1905 to 1998 also studied with Spearman, concluded that intelligence was about 65% genetically determined. One of Burt's most controversial followers, Arthur Jensen, argued for an even greater nature effect and even smaller nurture influence based on his twin studies. In the end, perhaps the Burt episode taught us more about the policies of science than about the nature of intelligence. Among Burt's supporters were those who believed that the high heritability of intelligence had been proven scientifically. And this is a fact of, or ought to have been, implications of societal and educational policy. Such views, once linked to race, were made Jensen so controversial. On the other hand, Burt's critics believed not just that evidence for IQ heritability is unpersuasive, but that any event increased educational assistance for some students based on moral, not scientific principles. This controversy between conservatives or nativists and liberals, nurturists, was rekindled by the publication of Hergenhahn and Murphy's The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure of American Life in 1994, as we will discuss the bell curve later in this chapter. Intelligence testing in the United States. Henry Herbert Goddard. Henry Herbert Goddard, in 1866 to 1957, was born into a New England Quaker family and obtained his bachelor's and master's degree from Haverford College. After being a high school teacher and then principal for several years, he enrolled in a doctoral program in psychology at Clark University to pursue his interest in education and psychology. Goddard did his doctoral dissertation, which investigated the psychological factors involved in faith healing under the supervision of G. Stanley Hall. After completing his degree in 1899, Goddard first accepted a teaching position at Pennsylvania State Normal School. And then in 1906, he became the director of research at New Jersey Training School in Vineland, which was established for the education and care of the feeble-minded, Goddard's terms, children. Probably picked that up at Pennsylvania State Normal School. It was Goddard who translated the Binet-Simon scale into English. Although initially skeptical of the scale, he found it to be very effective in classifying children in terms of their degree of retardation. Goddard then translated all of Binet and Simon's works into English, and following Binet's death in 1911, became the world's leading proponent of Binet's approach to measuring intelligence. However, although accepting Binet's testing procedures, Goddard accepted the Galton-Cattell-Spearman hereditarian view of nature of intelligence rather than Binet's. In addition to administering the translated Binet-Simon scale to the children at the training school, Goddard also administered it out to 2,000 public school students in New Jersey. He was shocked to find that many of the public school students performed below the norms of their age. This especially disturbed Goddard because of his belief that intelligence was largely inherited. The belief, he thought, was supported by his observation that the children at Vinland often had brothers and sisters who were feeble-minded. The study of the Kallikak family. Goddard decided to investigate the relationship between family background and intelligence more carefully, and in 1911 he administered the Binet-Simon scale to a young woman he called Deborah Kallikak, who he had been living at the training school since 1897. Kallikak was a fictitious name that Goddard created out of the Greek word kalos, or good, and kakos, bad. Although Deborah's chronological age was 22, her performance yielded a mental age of 9, producing an IQ of about 41. Goddard coined the term moron, to denote Deborah's intellectual level. He then traced Deborah's ancestries back to the American Revolution, where Martin Kallikak Sr. had a relationship with a feeble-minded barmaid that resulted in the birth of Martin Kallikak Jr. After leaving the army, the elder Martin married a worthy girl, and they had 7 children. Younger Martin eventually married and had 10 children. In Goddard's analysis, the descendants of the elder Martin and the worthy girl represented the good side of Deborah's ancestries, and the descendants of the younger Martin represented the bad side. Goddard found that of the elder Martin's children, none were feeble-minded, whereas 5 of the younger Martin's children were. In subsequent generations on the younger Martin side, Goddard found an abundance of individuals with mental deficiencies. In Goddard's time, people were believed that feeble-mindedness was the cause of most criminal, immoral, and antisocial behavior. And Goddard supported this belief by showing that many descendants of younger Martin had been horse thieves, prostitutes, convicts, alcoholics, parents of illegitimate children, and sexual deviants. Of the hundreds of descendants from the elder Martin marriage, only 3 had mental deficiencies, and 1 had been considered sexually loose. Among the elder Martin's descendants had been doctors, lawyers, educators, and other prestigious individuals. Goddard reported his findings in The Kallikak Family, a study of the heredity of feeble-mindedness. His research was taken as support for the Galtonian belief that intelligence was genetically determined. Along with Goddard, several leading scientists of the day urged that those with mental deficiencies be sterilized and segregated from the rest of society. They contended that because the feeble-minded could not be expected to control their own reproduction, the intelligent members of society must control it for them. If both parents are feeble-minded, all of the children will be feeble-minded. It is obvious that such matings should not be allowed. It is perfectly clear that no feeble-minded person should ever be allowed to marry or to become a parent. It is obvious that this rule is to be carried out, and the intelligent part of society must enforce it. No fewer than 20 states passed the sterilization laws, and thousands of undesirables were sterilized. In some states, the sterilization law was enforced until the 1970s. Mental testing and immigration. In the years 1905 to 1913, millions of individuals immigrated from Europe to the United States, and there was a growing concern that many of these immigrants might have mental deficiencies. The question was how to know for certain, and in 1912, the Commissioner of Immigration invited Goddard to Ellis Island to observe the immigrants. Goddard claimed that he could tell that many of the immigrants had mental deficiencies simply by observing their physical characteristics. I fucking hate this guy. But to be sure, he administered the Binet-Simon scale. On the basis of the test results, many immigrants were labeled mentally defective, and thousands were deported. Goddard even went so far as to specify the European countries from which the percentage of immigrants with mental deficiencies was the highest. In general, Goddard concluded that 40% and 50% of immigrants were morons. As with his earlier work, Goddard assumed that immigrants' test performance was mainly due to inherited intelligence and not to educational, cultural, or personal experience, all factors that were later found to influence test performance. But the immigrants were also taking the test under special circumstances. For the evident reason, consider a group of frightened men and women who speak no English, who have to just endure an oceanic voyage in steerage. Most are poor and have never gone to school. Many have never held a pencil or pen in their hand, and they march off the boat. One of Goddard's assistants takes them aside shortly thereafter, sits them down, hands them a pencil, and asks them to reproduce on paper a figure shown to them a moment ago, but now withdrawn from their sight. Could their failure be a result of testing conditions for weakness, fear, and confusion, rather than innate stupidity? Goddard considered the possibility, but rejected it. Furthermore, the tests were administered by the translator, whose accuracy in translating the test into an immigrant's native tongue was taken on faith. Because of Goddard's efforts, the rate of deportation increased 350% in 1913 and 570% in 1914. Although he regretted the loss to the United States of inexpensive labor. The picture of him, I just draw something on his face, you know what I mean? Lewis Madison Terman, 1877 to 1956, was born the 12th of 14 children to a farming family from central Indiana. At age 9, a phrenology book salesman gave each member of the Terman family a phrenological analysis. Terman's analysis indicated great promise, thus stimulating him to aspire for life beyond the farm. He went to a one-room school and completed the 8th grade when he was 12 years old. At age 15, Terman left to attend Central Normal College in Danville, Indiana. At age 17, he began teaching in a rural school. Within 6 years after leaving home, Terman had taught school and earned 3 undergraduate degrees, one in arts, one in sciences, and one in pedology. The next 3 years were busy ones for Terman. He became a high school principal, a husband, and a father. And in 1901, Terman enrolled in Indiana University, where he pursued a master's degree in pedagogy. Upon completing his degree, he received an offer for doctoral study at Clark University. With financial support from his family, Terman was able to accept, and soon he was off to study at G. Stanley Hall. Terman did not write his dissertation under Hall's supervision, however. Terman became increasingly interested in mental testing, and Hall had little enthusiasm for the topic. Under the supervision of Edmund C. Stanford, who was the APA president in 1902, Terman isolated a group of bright students and a group of dull students, and then attempted to determine what types of tests could be used to differentiate between the two groups. Terman was unaware that Binet-Simon had already done essentially the same thinking earlier. Terman's dissertation was titled Genius and Stupidity, the study of intellectual processes of 7 bright and 7 stupid boys. Terman was to say later in his life that all of his career interests were shaped during his years at Clark. Before obtaining his doctorate from Clark University in 1905, Terman had become seriously ill with tuberculosis, and although he recovered, he thought it would be best that he choose a warm climate in which to work, and for that reason he accepted a position as a high school principal in San Bernardino, California. A year later, he began teaching a child study of pedagogy. Pedagogy at Los Angeles State Normal School. Why do they call them that? Whatever. Later to become University of California, Los Angeles. In 1910, Terman accepted an appointment to their educational department at Stanford University, where he spent the rest of his career and became a chair of the psychology department in 1922, a position he held until his retirement in 1942. And in 1923, Terman also served as the president of the American Psychological Association. It was coincidental with his arrival at Stanford that Terman became aware of the Binet-Simon intelligence scale, although through Goddard's translation. Terman began immediately to work with the scale and found that it could not be used in the on U.S. children without modifications. So the Stanford Binet test. It might be Binet. We still don't know. I'm not looking it up. Terman found that when Binet-Simon scale was administered to U.S. children, the results were uneven. For example, Terman observed that items from the Binet-Simon scale were too easy for 5-year-olds and too difficult for 12-year-olds. It caused the mental age of average 5-year-olds to be artificially high and the average 12-year-olds to be artificially low. Working with his graduate student H.G. Childs, Terman deleted existing items from the Binet-Simon scale and added new items until the average score of the sample of children was 100, no matter what their age. This meant that for each age group tested, the average mental age would equal the child's chronological age. Terman and Childs published their first version of the Binet-Simon scale in 1912, and in 1916, Terman alone published a further revision. And in 1916, revision became known simply as Stanford Binet. It was in 1916 that Terman adopted Stern's intelligence ratio, and suggested that the ratio be multiplied by 100 to remove the decimal point, and they called the ratio IQ. The Stanford Binet, which made Terman both rich and famous, was revised in 1937 and again in 1960 after Terman's death. Incidentally, Wolff in 1973 noted that Terman brought the legal rights to translate the Binet-Simon scale into English for $1. Terman's position on inheritance. Throughout his career, Terman believed that intelligence was largely inherited. Furthermore, Terman, like Goddard, believed that low intelligence was the cause of most criminal and other forms of antisocial behavior. For Terman in 1916, a stupid person could not be a moral person. Not all criminals are feeble-minded, but all feeble-minded persons are at least potential criminals. That every feeble-minded woman is a potential prostitute would hardly be disputed by anyone. Moral judgment, like business judgment, social judgment, or any other kind of higher thought process, is a function of intelligence. Morality cannot flower and fruit if intelligence remains infantile. And in 1922, Terman said, there's nothing about an individual as important as his IQ, except possibly his morals. The great test problem of democracy is how to adjust itself to the large IQ differences which can be demonstrated to exist among members of any race or nationality group. All of the available facts that science has to offer support the Galtonian theory that mental abilities is chiefly a matter of original endowment. It is the highest 25% of our population, the more especially the top 5%, we must look for production of leaders who will advance science, art, government, education, social welfare, and generally. Social welfare generally. The least intelligent 15 to 20% of the population are democracy's ballast and will always use, and not always useless, but always a potential liability. How to make the most of their limited abilities, both for their own welfare and for that of society. How to lead them without making them helpless victims of oppression and are perennial questions of any democracy. Although Terman was impressed by and borrowed much from Binet, his view of intelligence was much more like that of Galton. Terman was so struck by Galton that he published an intellectual portrait of him in which he estimated Galton's IQ to be nearly 200. Terman's contention that IQ is a valid measure of native intelligence did not go unchallenged. Among Terman's harshest critics was the journalist Walter Lippmann. Lippmann and Terman debated in a series of articles appearing in the New Republic from 1922 to 1923. And in one of these articles, Lippmann in 1923 wrote, "I hate the impudence of the claim that in 50 minutes you, Terman, can judge and classify human beings being predestined fitness in life. I hate the pretentiousness of the claim. I hate the abuse of the scientific method which it involves. I hate the sense of superiority which it creates and the sense of inferiority which it imposes." Snaps. Terman validated the Stanford Binet by correcting test performance with teacher ratings of academic performance, teacher estimations of intelligence, and school grades. He found fairly high correlations in each case, but this was not surprising because the traits and abilities that schools and teachers valued highly in students were the same traits and abilities that yielded high scores on the Stanford Binet. Nonetheless, the correlations meant that academic performance could be predicted with some success from test performance. Terman's study of genius. In Terman's day, it was widely believed that very bright children were abnormal and more than in a statistical sense. One common expression describing children was early ripe, early rot, suggesting that if mental ability developed too fast in an early age, not enough would remain for the later years. To objectively study the experience of bright children through the years, Terman ran one of the most famous studies in psychology's history by identifying highly intelligent children and observing them over a long period of time. Terman could evaluate his beliefs that those with high IQs were more successful later in life than those with lower IQs. His first step, Terman defined genius as a score of 135 or higher on his test. Next, he and his colleagues administered the test to thousands of California school children, and he isolated 1,528 gifted children, 856 boys, 672 girls. The average chronological age of the group was 11, and the average IQ of the group was 151. Learning everything, that's incredible. Learning everything he could about his subjects, including their interests, family history, health, physical characteristics, and personality, Terman wanted to study the experiences of the group member as they matured through the years. He began his study in 1921 and reported the first year results in Genetic Studies of Genius, 1926. The term genetic can have two meanings. First, it meant developmental. When the term is being used in this sense, the genetic study is one that traces how something varies as a function of maturation over time. And the second, genetic, can refer to the genes or the chromosomes responsible for the various traits. Terman used the term in a developmental sense. Terman found that children in his study who referred to themselves as termites, that's great, had parents with above average educational backgrounds, had learned to read at an early age, participated in a wide variety of activities, produced schoolwork that was unusually excellent. All of this might have been expected. The major question was how these children would fare as they become older. Terman did follow-up studies in 1927, 1928, when the average age of the group was about 16, and again in 1939 to 1940 when the average age was around 29. These studies indicated that test scores were still in the upper 1% of the general population. The members of the group still participated in a wide variety of activities and excelled in most of them they were still outstanding academically. 70% of the men and 67% of the women had finished college, and 56% of the men and 33% of the women had gone on for at least one advanced degree. All of these percentages were far higher than for the general population at the time. In 1947, Terman appeared on a radio show, Quiz Kids. On the show, bright, healthy children were asked extremely difficult questions in which they typically knew the answers. Terman appeared on the program because he felt that he was responsible for correcting many of the misconceptions about gifted children. In fact, Terman thought the program did more in that regard than his own work had done. I've devoted a good part of my life to the research on children with high IQ, but despite all of my investigations and those of others, many people continue to think that a brainy child is a freak, physically stunted, mentally lopsided, non-social, and neurotic. Then came the Quiz Kids program, featuring living specimens of highly gifted youngsters who are obviously healthy, wholesome, and well-adjusted, socially minded, full of fun, and versatile beyond belief. Results: the program has done more to correct popular misconceptions about bright children than all of the books ever written. It is probably best that it was not until after Terman's death that it was discovered that the Quiz Kids were often given the questions in advance of the show. The final follow-up in which Terman participated took place in 1950 to 1952. It showed that members of the group continued to excel in most categories studied. All that time, members of the group had attained prominence: doctors, lawyers, teachers, judges, engineers, authors, actors, scientists, and business people. Upon Terman's death in 1956, the directorship of the investigation was taken over by Robert R. Sears, a Stanford professor who was one of Terman's termites. Sears also served as APA president in 1951. And in the 1970s, two Stanford professors were added to the investigation team. Lee J. Cronbach, 1916 to 2001, another APA president, 1957, and a termite. And Pauline S. Sears, Robert's wife. In the tradition of Pearson and Spearman, Cronbach is perhaps even better known for his work in psychometrics. Many of the psychologists assess the reliability, validity, and generalizability of their studies are based on his contributions to statistics. Another data collection phase of the study was completed in 1986 under the supervision of Robert Sears and Albert Hasteroff. who took over the project after Sears died. The group of gifted individuals identified by Terman in 1921 has been studied intensely for more than 80 years, and the study continues. For example, Tomlinson, Keesley, and Little in 1990 examined 1,069 of the original 1528 termites and found that although generally successful and well-adjusted, some were more successful and well-adjusted than others. The authors isolated the variables related to differential achievement and personal adjustment levels so that they may be used to predict and enhance the achievement and adjustment of other gifted individuals. Friedman et al. In 1995 examined the backgrounds of a sample of Terman's termites who were deceased as of 1991. They found that certain psychosocial and behavioral variables were significant predictors of premature mortality, such as parental divorce during childhood, unstable marriage patterns during adulthood, certain childhood personality characteristics such as being unconscientious, psychological instability in adulthood, and unhealthy habits such as excessive smoking and drinking. For the researchers involved in Terman's longitudinal study, the primary results were clear. The gifted child becomes a gifted adult. Terman believed strongly that giftedness is inherited, but subsequent research has shown that many of Terman's results can be explained by taking into account the group members' experiences. How much of intelligence is genetically determined and how much is environmentally determined are still hotly contested questions in psychology. Most modern researchers, however, concede that both factors are important. In any case, Terman's longitudinal study of gifted individuals clearly showed that individuals who scored high on the so-called measures of intelligence early in life do not deteriorate later in life. In fact, his results showed that those who fare best in youth also tend to fare best as mature adults. Leda Stellar Hollingworth. Okay. For Terman, the primary purpose of mental testing was the identification of gifted individuals so that they could be encouraged to reach their full potential and become societal leaders. He believed that a tracking system whereby gifted students are provided educational experiences different from those provided for non-gifted children is essential for the survival of democracy. Mainly through the efforts of Terman and his colleagues, intelligence testing and the ability grouping was common practices in the U.S. elementary schools in 1930. However, Terman had no specific recommendations concerning the educational methods that should be adopted in meeting the needs of intellectually superior children. It was Leda Steter Hollingworth, who was primarily concerned with the developing educational strategies that would ensure the developmental well-being of gifted students. Born Leda A. Stetter, Hollingworth attended her bachelor's degree at the University of Nebraska, and in 1908, Hollingworth, who had been teaching school in Nebraska, accompanied her husband Harry to New York, where he had been hired as a psychology instructor at Columbia University. Harry L. Hollingworth himself went on to gain considerable prominence as a psychologist. Earning his Ph.D. under Cattell at Columbia, he wrote 25 books on psychological topics and served as the president of the American Psychological Association in 1927. Leda Hollingworth intended to continue teaching in New York, but discovered that the city had a policy of not employing married women as teachers. She decided to enroll as a graduate student at Columbia University, where she took courses from Edward L. Thorndike, as we'll see in the next chapter, who became her advisor. It was through Thorndike that she developed an interest in psychological testing. However, Hollingworth was also interested in many misconceptions about women that were prevalent at the time. To her surprise, Thorndike agreed to supervise her dissertation on functional periodicity, maybe, which investigated the notion of women that women are psychologically impaired during menstruation. She found no evidence of such an impairment. Hollingworth also challenged the widely accepted belief system that intelligence is largely inherited and that women are intellectually inferior to males. At the time, Thorndike was among those who shared these beliefs. Hollingworth, in 1940, believed that women reach positions of prominence less often than men's, not because of intellectual inferiority, but because of the social roles assigned to them. Why do we not consider first the established, obvious, inescapable fact that women bear and rear the race, and that this has always meant and still means that nearly 100% of their energy is consumed in the performance and supervision of domestic and allied tasks? A field where eminence is possible. No one knows who is the best housekeeper in America. Eminent housekeepers do not and cannot exist. If we discuss at at all the matter of sex differences in achievement, we should consider first the most obvious conditioning factors. Otherwise, our discussion is futile scientifically. Thorndike later modified his views on intelligence to stress nurture more than nature. Hollingsworth believed that she was at least partially responsible for his revised beliefs. She also discussed that with Charman, her belief that more men than women are classified as gifted, not because of differential intellectual abilities, but because of the social factors. Charman did eventually modify his nativistic position concerning gender differences in intelligence, allowing for social influences, but he maintained his belief that intelligence was primarily genetically determined. After receiving her master's degree in 1913, Hollingworth worked for a while as the clinical psychologist at the New York City Clearinghouse for Mental Defectives. Did they say that mental defectives? Yeah. Mental defectives, where she administered Binet tests. She then worked at Bellevue Hospital as a clinical psychologist until attaining her doctorate from Columbia University in 1916. Soon thereafter, she became a professor of education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her work at the Clearinghouse made her realize that there are many individual myths about so-called mentally defective individuals, as there are as many myths about mentally defective individuals as there are about women. For example, she found that many individuals classify as defective where in reality manifesting social and personal adjustment problems. In a series of books, Hollingworth attempted to correct this and related problems. The Psychology of Subnormal Children, Special Talents and Defects, Their Significance for Education, and the Psychology of the Adolescent. The last replaced G. Stanley Hall's text as the standard in the field. Hollingworth next concentrated her attention on the education of gifted children. She observed that simply classifying a child as gifted is not enough. Emphasizing abstract test scores and group characteristics causes the needs of an individual students to be overlooked. As an example, she described the experience of a gifted 8-year-old girl named Jean, who typically finishes her assignments more quickly than her classmates. The teacher's reaction to this problem was to have Jean write digits in a book over and over again until her classmates could finish their assignments. Jean had with her copy books in which she had been writing for the past year, one digit after another, by the hour. Jean's mother said, "She can't stand the numbers any longer. Her hands get stiff. I wish you could see the thousands of rows of digits obediently inscribed by this intelligent child." Finally, she burst out crying, "I can't stand the numbers anymore." Correcting such mistreatment of gifted children occupied Hollingworth for the rest of her career, and in 1926 she published Gifted Children, which became the standard text in schools of education for many years. And Children Above 180 IQ was published posthumously in 1942. For more about this impressive woman and her role in history of psychology, see Benjamin, 1975, and Shields. Intelligence testing in the Army. Robert M. Yerkes, 1876 to 1956, was a firstborn son of a rural Pennsylvania farm family. He was disillusioned by farm life. However, he dreamed of becoming a medical doctor. During his college years, Yerkes lived with an uncle of whom he did chores in return for tuition at Erasmus College. After Erasmus, Yerkes went to Harvard, where he became interested in animal behavior. Obtaining his doctorate in 1902, he remained at Harvard as a faculty member. With his friend John B. Watson, who was then at Johns Hopkins University, Yerkes established comparative psychology in the United States. In recognition of his ultimate success, Yerkes was elected president of the APA in 1917, and the United States' leading primate research facility now honors his name. As a student, Yerkes had to borrow considerable amounts of money, and his faculty post at Harvard did not pay very much. This meant that he had to take part-time jobs in order to survive financially. Hence, in 1912, he took the job of director of psychological research at Boston Psychopathic Hospital. It was there that Yerkes had his first experience with intelligence testing. At the hospital, Binet-Simon scale was being explored as an instrument to aid clinical diagnoses. One of Yerkes' Harvard professors, now his friend and colleague, was the biologist Charles Davenport, who corresponded with Galton and was a leader in the U.S. eugenics movement. Yerkes' contribution to intelligence testing was his suggestion that all individuals be given all items on the Binet-Simon test and be given points for the items passed. Thus, a person's score would be in terms of total points earned instead of IQ. This removes the age factor of scoring. The traditional procedure following the administration of the Binet-Simon scale was to locate the range of tests appropriate for a given individual. For example, 7-year-old being tested, the tests appropriate for that age would be given. If the child missed any of those tests, and the test appropriate for the next lowest age would be administered. If, in this case, the child initially passed all tests appropriate for 7-year-old level, tests from an 8-year-old level would be administered, and so forth until the child began to fail the tests. In other words, using age as a frame of reference, the testing procedure was customized for each child. Yerkes' point scale procedure rendered all of this unnecessary. Yerkes did point out, however, that point norms could be established for various ages and for any group one wanted to compare. Yerkes believed that besides being easy to administer, point scores were more amenable to statistical analysis than IQ scores. Also because the point scores of individuals take the same test without regard to their age or level. Yerkes' method is conducive to group retesting, whereas the Binet-Simon test has to be given to one. The Binet-Simon test has to be given to one person at a time. Soon, Yerkes would see his method tried on a level he never dreamed possible.